Some rooms were built to remind people of their place in the world. The Harbourview Grand's private terrace lounge, on the 14th floor of its heritage tower, was exactly that kind of room. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the harbor, the North Shore Mountains, still holding their last light behind the glass. Round tables dressed in white linen and centered with flowers so fresh they still carried the faint smell of a greenhouse. It was a room that had been designed for a specific kind of person, and that person was not supposed to arrive carrying a tote bag and wearing a plain gray hoodie. Selene Ofori had arrived that way anyway. She was 45 years old, and if you had passed her in the lobby that evening, which most people had, without a second look, you would have seen a compact woman with close-cropped natural hair threaded at the temples with silver, moving through the hotel's corridors with the unhurried attention of someone taking inventory. She had a notepad in one hand, though she rarely used it. She had worked in these kinds of spaces long enough to carry most of what she needed in her head. She had grown up in Scarborough, in a 2-bedroom apartment where 4 people slept in 2 rooms, and the heat sometimes went out in February. Her mother had cleaned offices downtown every weekday morning, that starting at 5, and had come home smelling of industrial cleaner and the specific exhaustion of a woman who had never once been thanked for making other people's spaces beautiful. Selene had watched her mother's hands at the dinner table. Knuckles reddened, cuticles cracked, and had made a decision so early in her life that it didn't feel like a decision at all. It felt like a fact she had always known. She had learned to code at the public library on Markham Road, using whatever terminal was free, staying until the librarian turned off the lights. By 19, she had built 3 apps and sold 2 of them. By 28, she had founded Ironlake Systems, a data infrastructure company that within 7 years had become one of the fastest-growing technology firms in Canada. The third time someone had described her as quietly worth a great deal of money, she had laughed and corrected them. There was nothing quiet about what it had taken to get there. Ironlake's portfolio now included the Harbourview Grand. Selene had bought the property 3 years ago through a holding company as part of a larger real estate acquisition that her board had questioned at the time. She had asked them to trust her read on the building and the neighborhood's 15-year trajectory. They had, somewhat reluctantly. The renovation came in under budget. The hotel's revenue increased 42% in its first year under new management. Nobody questioned her reads anymore. She came every few months, always without announcing herself in advance, always dressed like someone who had just come from a meeting in a different building. She walked the halls, ate in the restaurant, talked to the housekeeping staff and the kitchen team and the concierge. She listened to what they told her, not the formal answers that came out when people knew they were being observed by ownership, but the offhand comments, the hesitations, the small corrections that told you how a place actually ran when no one with authority was watching. Tonight, the hotel was hosting the Forsythe Summit. 3 days of talks, workshops, and closed-door conversations among some of the most significant voices in Canadian technology and innovation. Alistair Forsythe, who had built and sold 2 telecom companies before his 50th birthday, organized it annually, rotating between Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. Selene had attended for 6 consecutive years. She was delivering the keynote address tomorrow morning. Tonight, though, she was just walking the floor. The terrace lounge had been reserved for a private pre-summit dinner. 40 guests, most of them known to her by name, and in several cases by the specific terms of deals they had done together over the years. The hotel's event staff had been briefed. The catering had been coordinated 2 weeks in advance. Everything, from what Selene had seen walking through the kitchen 20 minutes earlier, was running exactly as it should. She stood near the service corridor entrance, making a small note about the ambient lighting in the northeast corner. Too warm for the later part of the evening, she thought, when people's eyes started to fatigue. When the private elevator opened, and a woman stepped out who carried herself like someone arriving at an event that had been waiting to begin until she got there. The woman was tall, perhaps 48 or 49, in a pale green evening suit that had been precisely fitted and precisely pressed. Her hair was colored a warm auburn and pulled into a smooth, low arrangement at the back of her head. She wore the kind of watch that was not worn to tell the time. Her name was Arabella Holt. Her husband was a senior partner at a venture capital firm whose name appeared in Selene's email inbox on an irregular but consistent basis, mostly in contexts that required a specific kind of patience to navigate. Arabella entered the room with the momentum of someone who had decided, before setting foot inside, that the space would probably disappoint her, but that she would endure it graciously. She moved through the initial cluster of early arrivals, with a smile that offered just enough warmth to qualify as a smile and nothing more, accepting drinks and introductions with the ease of a woman who had been performing this particular social function for 2 decades and had not, in all that time, been particularly surprised by anything or anyone. She had grown up with money and had grown into more of it. Somewhere in that trajectory, she had arrived at a version of herself that treated the world's service infrastructure, the people who checked her coat, poured her wine, changed her sheets, as a category of existence rather than a collection of individuals. It was not something she thought about. That in some ways was the point. The not thinking was the whole architecture of it. She moved toward the outer windows and their view of the harbor, and as she did, she passed a young man named Luca, 22 years old, 3 months into his first hotel position, carrying a tray of water glasses with the concentration of someone who understood that a single mistake in this room would carry consequences beyond the tray. He had been warned about the carpet seam near the service pillar. He had been careful. He made it past the pillar cleanly, then turned to offer a glass to a nearby guest, and in the small space between that turn and the guest's hand reaching forward, Arabella stepped backward without looking, and her elbow connected with the corner of the tray. One glass fell. It didn't shatter. The carpet caught it, but the water spread across the floor in a shape that was undeniable, and 2 or 3 nearby guests stepped quietly away from the wet patch. Luca was already bending to retrieve the glass, reaching for the folded cloth at his belt loop. He looked up at Arabella and said he was sorry. Arabella looked at him the way a person looks at a parking ticket, a flat 10 contained displeasure directed at something that has had the poor judgment to exist inconveniently. She told him he should watch where he was going. She said it with the particular authority of someone who had been walking into things for years, into people, into the edges of other people's days, and had never once been asked to consider who was doing most of the colliding. She said that an event of this caliber deserved better than staff who couldn't manage a simple tray of water without causing a scene. Luca did not look up from the carpet. He was blotting the water with practiced efficiency. His face held the careful smoothness of someone who had been told, before they started, that guests were sometimes like this, and that the correct response was professionalism, not honesty. Selene had been watching from 12 feet away. She crossed the distance in a few even steps and positioned herself close to Luca, not between him and Arabella exactly, but near enough to make her presence register. She said quietly that the carpet seam in that section was a known issue and that the hotel was addressing it. She said that Luca had been navigating it carefully all evening. She said this in the measured tone of someone relaying a factual correction, not lodging a complaint. Arabella looked at her. Her eyes moved across Selene's gray hoodie, her tote bag, her silver-edged hair, and arrived at a conclusion that took perhaps 3 seconds, and no information she hadn't decided she already had. She said she wasn't speaking to Selene. Selene looked back at her and said nothing. Not nothing in the sense of having nothing to say. Nothing in the sense of someone who has learned, over a long lifetime, to choose exactly when their words are worth spending. Arabella turned back to survey the room with the expression of someone who had just settled a minor matter and was ready to move on. But as she turned, she said something to the woman standing beside her. A quiet, horizontal remark aimed at no one, and everyone in the way these remarks often are, directed toward the windows, toward the harbor, toward the mountains, still faintly visible in the last of the evening light. She said that she didn't know who let these people wander around during a private event. The woman beside her said nothing. She looked at her drink. A guest nearby heard it. A man in his early 60s, a product designer from Waterloo, who had attended the summit for 4 years running, heard it, and his expression shifted in the small, uncomfortable way of a person who has just recognized that they are now part of something they want no part of. He looked at Luca. He looked at Selene. He looked down at his own hands and did not move. Luca finished blotting the carpet and straightened up. He held the tray level. He looked at Selene, and whatever he saw in her face settled him slightly, though he could not have named what it was. The dinner service began, and the room found its rhythm. Conversations assembled themselves, deals were approached from their sidelong angles. The catering staff moved through it all with practiced quiet. For a time, the earlier moment receded into the general ambient noise of the evening. Then Arabella found Selene again. It was near the terrace railing, where Selene had paused to speak briefly with one of the event coordinators about the northeast corner temperature. Arabella came around the adjacent table and stopped when she saw Selene standing there with what appeared, to Arabella's eye, to be a member of the hotel's event staff. She asked, without preamble, whether Selene was with catering. Selene said she was with the hotel. Arabella said she had a concern about the centerpiece at table 4. It was blocking the sightline between two guests who needed to be able to speak easily, and that someone should have caught this during setup. Selene said she would look into it. Arabella said she wanted it dealt with now, and added, in the same flat-carrying voice, that it was remarkable how often these things had to be spelled out for people who were supposed to be professionals. The event coordinator beside Selene was very still. Selene said evenly that the centerpiece could be moved to the service credenza, and that it would take about 40 seconds, and that she would see it was done. Something in Selene's tone, not the words, but the particular quality of calm behind them, the complete absence of any performance of deference, registered as friction. Arabella was accustomed to a different kind of response from this category of person. She was accustomed to the friction resolving itself immediately, in her direction, because it always had. She said she didn't want someone to see it was done. She wanted to see it being done, right now, by someone. She gestured toward Selene when she said it. The gesture was small and precise, and entirely clear about what it meant. Then Arabella reached out and took hold of Selene's wrist. A short, firm grip, the automatic claim of someone who had been reaching out and taking hold of things for a very long time, and began to turn Selene in the direction of table 4. The room noticed. Selene did not move. She stood exactly where she was, and something about the absoluteness of her stillness, the complete, grounded refusal of it, made Arabella's hand feel, for a fraction of a second, as though she had put it around something immovable. She let go. Luca had seen it from across the room. He set his tray on the nearest surface, walked to the hotel security officer, stationed near the private elevator, and said, clearly and quietly, that a guest had just physically grabbed a member of the hotel's ownership group, and that he wanted that documented. The security officer looked at him, looked across the room to where Selene stood, and reached for the tablet at his belt. Arabella had not registered any of this. She was looking at Selene, and now there was a different quality to her attention. Something more engaged, something close to suspicion, as though she had just pressed a wall expecting plaster and encountered stone. She said, her voice lifting slightly, that she was a guest of Alistair Forsythe and expected to be treated accordingly, and that if Selene couldn't perform her function at a basic level, someone who could should be sent out immediately. Around them, the nearest conversations had gone quiet, in the incremental way that rooms go quiet when they are paying attention while pretending not to. Selene stood with her tote bag at her shoulder, and her hands easy at her sides, and she looked at Arabella Holt with the focused, unfrightened attention of a woman who had stood in a great many rooms where people had tried, in one way or another, to define her by what they had decided she was before she opened her mouth. She said, in a voice just loud enough for those already listening to catch, "I know exactly who I am in this room. I'm less certain that you do." She said nothing else. Arabella stared at her. The response didn't fit. It didn't land where Arabella's words usually landed, and the displacement created a silence that was loud in a way she didn't know how to fill. Then the private elevator opened, and Alastair Forsythe walked in. He was 71 years old, built narrow and straight, silver-haired, wearing the kind of plain dark suit that only looked unremarkable until you understood who was wearing it. He moved through rooms the way certain people do, not commanding attention so much as being already assumed to have it. He greeted guests as he crossed toward the terrace railing, and his eyes found Selene before they found anyone else in that section of the room. They found her because he knew where to look. He always knew where Selene Ofori was in a room, because wherever she was, that was where the thing of consequence was about to happen. His expression changed when he saw her wrist, the slight redness already beginning to fade, and his face went still in a way it rarely went still. He turned to the room without raising his voice. He didn't need to. He said that he understood something had occurred this evening, that he wanted to address directly. He said it without preamble, without managing the room's feelings first, in the manner of a man who had decided long ago that directness was more efficient than ceremony. He turned to Arabella. He said he would like to introduce her to Selene Ofori. He said the name, without adornment, without announcement, just the name, in the tone of someone who understood that the name itself was the whole sentence. Arabella's face held its composure. It was the kind of composure that required active maintenance. Alastair continued. He said that Selene Ofori was the founder and chief executive of Ironlake Systems, whose work in data infrastructure had been recognized that year by two federal innovation bodies, and which employed, as of their last quarterly report, just over 4,000 people across Canada. He said that Selene was delivering tomorrow morning's keynote address, which he personally considered the most anticipated session in the summit's 11-year history. He said that Selene was a member of the Harbourview Grand's ownership group, and that she visited this hotel and every property in her portfolio without announcing herself in advance, because she believed that the only honest picture of how a place ran was the one you got when no one knew the picture was being taken. He said that in 6 years of hosting this summit, he had never permitted a guest to physically lay hands on a member of his team, and that he was not going to begin this evening. He said that the incident had already been documented by hotel security, that a formal record would be made, and that his legal team would be in contact. Then he stopped speaking. The room was completely, finally, absolutely quiet. Arabella stood with her chin at an angle that was beginning to look less like composure and more like the structural precondition for composure collapsing. Around her, the social geography of the evening had rearranged itself with the swift, organic efficiency of a room that understood something had just been decided. The product designer from Waterloo set down his glass and moved towards Selene. He said, to her and to no one in particular, "For what it's worth, I should have said something earlier. I'm sorry I didn't." It was not a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one. But it changed the character of the room's silence in a way that could not be undone. 2 or 3 other guests moved in the same direction, not toward Arabella's table, but toward Selene. There was no orchestration to it. That was what made it legible as something real. At the end of the evening, Arabella attempted to reach Alastair privately. His assistant fielded the request with a courtesy so complete it left no opening. A second attempt through her husband's firm met a similar outcome. The documentation Alastair's legal team had prepared was specific, sourced from multiple witnesses, and had already been shared with 2 institutional investors who had been in the room and who sat on the board of Holt Capital. The consequences were not instantaneous. They rarely are. But in the weeks that followed, a co-investment that had been in discussion between Holt Capital and two other firms quietly dissolved. An advisory board position was not renewed. A gala invitation was not extended. These things happened without press releases, without accusations, through the private arithmetic of people who had witnessed something and made their own calculations accordingly. Arabella called the hotel eventually. She asked to speak to Selene. Selene called back 2 weeks later. She said she wanted to say something honest rather than easy. She said she had grown up in a world where people like Arabella were simply part of the landscape. They were in lobbies and elevators and waiting rooms. They were in offices and board meetings, and, sometimes, in the moments right before a deal was signed. They had the same flat, practiced authority, and the same assumption that the people who kept their world running were not quite real in the way that they themselves were real. She had been encountering them since she was 19 years old, and she had learned how to move through their assessments without letting those assessments become the ground she stood on. She said that what had happened in that room was not merely the moment Arabella's hand reached for her wrist. It was everything before it. The look in the elevator lobby, the remark about these people, the casual disposal of Luca's dignity, which had cost Arabella nothing and had cost Luca considerably more than the water on the carpet. She said she did not yet know what Arabella intended by calling. She did not know whether it was an apology in the genuine sense or a strategic positioning disguised as one, and she had seen enough of both to know she couldn't distinguish between them over the phone, 2 weeks after the fact. She said she would wait, that she thought that was the honest thing to say. Not that she forgave, not that she condemned, but that she had not yet decided, and that the decision deserved more time and more evidence than this phone call could offer. There was silence on the other end of the line. Arabella said she understood. Selene said she appreciated that. She hung up the phone and stood for a moment at the window of her Toronto office, a glass tower on King Street West, whose lease she had signed 12 years ago in a lobby where the receptionist had called her by the wrong name 3 times, and she had, each time, corrected herself quietly and kept walking and looked at the city laid out in its morning arrangement, gray and practical and endlessly, irreversibly itself. She thought about Luca, who had picked up that tray and kept going, who had walked across the room to a security officer and said, clearly and without drama, that something wrong had happened and that it should be recorded. She had called the hotel's general manager the morning after the summit and asked that a note be placed in Luca's file. Not in the language of performance reviews, but simply noting what she had observed. That he had kept his composure. That he had acted when others had not. That these were not small things, and should not be treated as though they were. She thought about the keynote she had delivered the following morning, with the texture of the previous evening still somewhere beneath her. Quiet and present the way things you have survived are present. She had walked out in front of 260 people in the same gray hoodie she had been wearing the night before. A choice she had made without drama, while drinking coffee in her hotel room at 6 in the morning, and had given a 40-minute talk on infrastructure, risk, and the particular kind of patience that building something real required. The applause at the end had been long, and to those who had been in the terrace lounge the night before, it had felt like more than one thing at once. Selene did not think of that morning as a victory. She thought of it as a Tuesday. She had had Tuesdays like it before, and she would have them again, and each one required the same thing. The decision, made again from the beginning, to bring her full self to the work in front of her, without asking the room's permission. She turned from the window and picked up her coffee. Her first meeting was in 8 minutes. There were things that could be taken from a person. A contract, a handshake, the casual assumption of their competence, the ordinary courtesy of being seen as real. She knew this. She had known it a long time, and she had stopped being surprised by it. though she had never stopped finding it worth naming when it happened. What could not be taken, what she had learned slowly and specifically over 25 years of building things in rooms that had not always wanted her in them, was the thing she carried in before anyone else arrived and took home after everyone else had gone. The thing that had been there in the Scarborough apartment, and in the library on Markham Road, and in the first pitch meeting, where she had sat across from three men who had not once made direct eye contact with her, and had still walked out with the term sheet. It was not a dramatic thing. It had no name she found entirely satisfying. It was closer to a habit than a philosophy. The daily, unremarked choice to do the work she was capable of, at the standard she was capable of, and to let that be what it was, without requiring anyone else's recognition to make it true. She drank her coffee. She picked up her phone. She walked down the hallway toward the first meeting of the day, and the city outside the glass went on being what it was, wide and cold and full of people who were, each in their own way, just trying to build something worth standing behind. She had always found that a reasonable thing to be part of.